Check 1, 2, 3. How y'all doing, guys? I got a question from the audience. In theory, you could have already read this in the description of this video, as I took a moment to copy and paste it. And the question basically was pushing me on a subtle distinction that I allowed to be implicit in my earlier video, talking about the nature of intelligence and the politics of what we do with IQ tests, other measures of both accomplishment and so-called intelligence. Now, Melissa, I think I have to ask you to close the window. We have a dog barking nearby, should I say. So the question I got from the audience that you can see in the description, I quoted it here verbatim, was, what do I mean? What do I have in mind when I contrast so-called meaningful measures of intelligence to, James Newman comments, this is some late broadcasting. It depends what time zone you're in. I am a little bit interested in that question. I generally do broadcast earlier in the day because I think a large percentage of my audience is in Europe. I think I have more viewers in Europe than I have in maybe Canada and the United States combined. But, you know, I do have some viewing members of the audience in New Zealand and Australia, so on and so forth. So sometimes I always just try to mix it up and see who shows up. And by the way, guys, if you hit the thumbs up button, it helps other people discover the broadcast and join us. I'm on the West Coast time zone, so it's not too late for me. The sun is still shining here in the middle of our June heat wave, which is another reason to broadcast later in the day. All right, so return to the topic of this video here. But guys, as you can see, if you want to comment, all right. So Lydia comments that she scored very high. All right, so let's start with some anecdotes here. So Lydia, do you want to tell us a little bit about how you wrote the IQ test and under what conditions? Because what people's motivations are for writing these tests is also a very interesting thing. Like, why would you write the IQ test? Was it to get a job? Was it to get into the military? You know, so on and so forth. Okay, so it was a joke, unfortunately. So you have it. Not that many people have written an IQ test. Why would you? Under what circumstances would someone write an IQ test? All right, I guess I'll start this way. Look, guys, when we think about intelligence, most of us are talking about completely subjective measures of intelligence that really have to do with how much sympathy we have for another person or how much common ground we have for them. I have had some Pakistani taxi drivers who say racist things while they're driving the taxi. They may say racist things. They may say homophobic things. They may say things from a conservative Muslim perspective that are shocking to me. But at my advanced age in life, I can appreciate that the extent to which I sympathize with someone politically, the amount I have in common with them, has absolutely nothing to do with how intelligent or unintelligent they are. Now, this same taxi driver, perhaps if the test of our intelligence is to drive a car through an obstacle course, there's a test of intelligence set up that requires us to do a number of things. Let's just say it's not just driving. Let's say we also have to memorize a map and move between a series of points on the map in an intelligent and sophisticated way and make strategic decisions. You know, these are skills he's built up over many years driving a taxi. If I go and drive through this same obstacle course with him, what do you know? He seems tremendously competent. He seems tremendously capable. He may certainly seem much more intelligent than I am. This is his forte. This is her expertise. Now, the particular taxi driver, it may be that my 5-minute conversation with him, I happen to be talking to him about his area of greatest weakness. Like, he happens to be racist. He happens to be homophobic. He's not terribly anyway, he's not on the ball about 21st century politics from my biased perspective, at least. But you know what? If you took the time and got to know him, you might learn more about his life. Maybe he started off as a farmer and he knows a lot about farming. And then he went to school to become a pilot, and he became a pilot in Pakistan. But he decided he really wasn't satisfied with social and political conditions in Pakistan. Maybe he can say some very intelligent things to you about politics in Pakistan and politics in India. I'm thinking of particular taxi drivers I've had. I've had some interesting conversations with taxi drivers about the politics they were escaping from. And he decided, you know what? He's better off driving a taxi in Canada than flying an airplane in Pakistan. Maybe he can tell you some really compelling things with us. And now you start to gain an appreciation for the man. And maybe now, if you've developed a friendship a bit, maybe you start to challenge him on his racist and homophobic statements, and you learn a little bit more about why he says these things or how he really feels. Oh, so now we have a whole relationship with someone and we have some kind of appreciation for their intelligence. in real life, when there are no tests involved, when there aren't numbers being assigned to people to quantify or measure their intelligence, this is what intelligence is for us. Intelligence is, for the most part, an index just of how much common ground, how much fellow feeling we have with someone. It's a very 18th century turn of phrase, fellow feeling. Stepping beyond this, when you're talking about meaningful measures of intelligence, we have to disaggregate them into three very different strata. First thumbs up for the video. So here's what I say. Shout out to you guys. You're skeptical as an audience. You've been listening for this long, 5 minutes, anything, maybe the thumbs up. Maybe. Sorry, I don't care. I got to say what I have to say either way. Shout out to Frida. Shout out to James. Shout out to Wow. The guy's name is Wow. It looks like every comment is beginning with the word Wow, but no, it's just someone whose name is Wow. Shout out to Tristan. Nice to see you all here. Yeah. He's saying that he recognizes that phrase "fellow feeling" from the translation of Max Stirner into English. Yeah, that has to do with the translator. I've been reading a lot from the period of the American Revolution and the 10 years leading up to the writing of the Constitution of the United States of America. So I honestly do not think it has influenced my writing style or my speaking style, but I've been seeing a lot of the peculiar turns of phrase that were used in that epoch and that era by erudite gentlemen who consider themselves in a position to rule the world, frankly. The megalomania of the authors of the Constitution. That'd be a great book unto itself. See, I got to start throwing out my ideas for MA theses and PhD theses here on live stream. There's a lot of stuff that tempts me to work more on, and to work on the Chinese perception of the American Revolution and American Constitution, and the Chinese perception of the French Revolution, and the way in which these revolutions are intertwined with each other. Pardon me. Anyway, I'm tempted to devote 10 years of my life to several different areas of study. Just now in working with history of the American Revolution, the writing of the Constitution. Okay, so I said that if we want to get serious about meaningful measures of intelligence, first of all, we have to disaggregate them into three very different strata. So I was asking Lydia before, what were your reasons for writing an intelligence test? Now, one reason in Canada for writing an intelligence test or having a specialist conduct an intelligence test is to establish whether or not you are so mentally disabled that the government will never expect you to have a job, never expect you to attend school, and will provide for you paid benefits for the rest of your life. This is very real. Now, I think in many countries with a sort of generous social system, there are these kinds of tests. So this is an intelligence test, but this is an intelligence test to establish whether you are employable, whether you are capable of attending primary school, like grade 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like a normal school for normal children, or not. This is a very serious, very important form of intelligence test. Now, I was generalizing, but to say Canada. In Canada, it's divided into several provinces, so it will be different in Quebec, different in Ontario. But anyway, we don't have a single national standard for these things. But I had a friend, and his sister was objectively mentally retarded due to a health condition her mother had during pregnancy. So it was an impaired pregnancy, or however you want to put it, due to the mother's illness during pregnancy. It's definite that the daughter had severely reduced mental capacity. But perhaps she would have been a genius if her mother didn't have this health problem during pregnancy, because she was given all of these tests at many stages of her youth and then as a teenager. And she never qualified as mentally disabled. She never qualified as retarded. She simply qualified as a very, very stupid, normal person. Now, you can imagine for the whole family, this was in part a triumph, but in part a tragedy. Like the parents, both of the parents were school teachers, incidentally. They were quite proud that they'd given their mentally disabled daughter enough education and enough encouragement that she qualified as not mentally retarded, that she was over the line into being a normal person. But of course, they had also, in effect, swindled her out of a lifetime of benefits. She now had to enter the workforce and find a job and go to school and compete with other people and so on. And she wouldn't get any of the help she would have gotten. You know, she would have been sent to special education and so on. She would have been given special education, special benefits if she had scored a little bit lower on these IQ tests. Now, I've spoken about this many times. I can't put enough emphasis on this first point, that if you're going to talk seriously about meaningful measures of intelligence, we have to disaggregate the low end of the scale when we're calibrating tests and we're testing people for these kinds of reasons to establish, for example, mental competence to be a witness in a court of law. Sometimes mentally retarded people are witnesses to a crime. And by the way, each country handles this very differently. If you think the standard is the same in Japan as it is in Louisiana or something, and some people, they are mentally disabled and they're capable of witnessing something and telling you it was there, but maybe they are so simple-minded that a lawyer can bully them into saying something else. Like they'll respond to that kind of coercion. Can this person really give a deposition in court? Is their eyewitness testimony legally valid? So there are intelligence tests to establish these things. Is someone intelligent enough to drive a car? Should they be regarded as too mentally disabled to drive a car? And just recently, I've already talked about this, I read a book, a dedicated book on the use of intelligence tests in the Vietnam War. Is someone intelligent enough to do military service, to hold a gun, to participate in warfare? Or are they too mentally disabled to take up such responsibilities? So these are very, very serious questions. And these can be certainly meaningful intelligence tests. And I don't think it's out of incompetence that right-wing demagogues misrepresent what intelligence tests are and what their political significance is in this way. I don't think it's possible for someone to misrepresent, whether it's the use of the IQ test or the Raven Squares test or any of these other things, or indeed even the military aptitude test or the SAT test, the university admissions test and this kind of thing, to misrepresent data that comes from evaluating the low end, from evaluating capacity and disability, and to misrepresent that as if it tells you something about the high end, how many people you have who are capable of being great poets or great painters. It's so ridiculous. And this is what I'm going to get to that later. What is our concept of greatness or genius or advanced intelligence? You guys already know, I've just been questioning, I've just been mocking the extent to which we assume that someone who works on the stock market as a stockbroker represents a very high level of intelligence. But the extent to which we can look at this kind of data that's developed from these types of measurements, calibrated in this way, as something meaningful about the average, the second segment, or the people at the extreme high end. And then again, part of what I'm questioning here is, what do we mean by the high end, right? Now, there's another kind of gap here, and that is the gap between objective measurements and subjective measurements. As I said before, subjective measurements have a lot to do with fellow feeling, with compassion, with sympathy, with common ground, even just with political and ideological agreement. There was a time when the president of the United States was George W. Bush. And I often had to explain to people that I don't say that he's stupid because I disagree with him or because I think he's wrong about some policy choice. I really genuinely think George W. Bush is stupid. It's quite a separate matter, like evaluating his intelligence. Obviously, the vast majority of people who condemn George W. Bush or Donald Trump or back in the day, Bill Clinton, a lot of people thought Bill Clinton was a tremendously stupid man. They are really saying that they morally condemn him, that they disagree with him, that they don't support the same policy choices, that they don't have this kind of common ground. So to say, if you step into the taxi and your taxi driver makes a series of racist remarks, homophobic remarks, and let's say politically provocative remarks. Let's say your taxi driver is a Donald Trump supporter who says some very shocking things to you while he's driving the taxi. And let's say you get upset and say, well, you must be a tremendously stupid man. And the taxi driver turns around and holds up his IQ test for you. And he scored he's in the top 1% of scores. He says, oh, you think I'm stupid? Well, I can prove it. I can prove that by intelligence. And of course, Mensa and these other institutes exist for this reason. How would you respond to that? How would any of us respond to that? There's this strange sense in which everyone who cares about this issue, or everyone who pretends to care about this issue, struggles with the gap between the significance of these subjective measures of intelligence, which is what we tend to really care about, and objective measures of intelligence. However, yes, ultimately, and especially at the low end, there are it's tremendous importance to having objectively real measures of intelligence. Okay, so I'm just going to read some questions from the audience, and I'll continue here. So Frida says that in the country she's living in, there are people who pretend they have some kind of baby syndrome to get government pensions. So yeah, meaning that they pretend that their child is disabled when it is not. Yeah, you know, anyways. Well, it gets darker than that. There are also people who actually injure their own children, who actually disable their own children. And I've read accounts of that too. If you're serious about political science, that's exactly the sort of thing you're supposed to study in political science. And it's no surprise that there's incredibly little research of that kind that goes on in departments of political science. Ronald says, so Ronald's been a long time viewer and supporter of the channel. Ronald Sims, I think I've seen you here for 5 or 7 years, man. Anyway, shout out to Ronald. We're broadcasting a good time for him, apparently. Anyway, he says he was tested as a kid because of autism during his youth. So, Ron, that's an interesting question. So if you tested positively for autism during your youth, did you later test negative? Is that you felt those tests were inaccurate? Or do you feel they were accurate, but you've been able to cope? Sorry, I'm asking out of sincere interest. I will not digress. Well, I could digress into this later if people are interested. But, you know, we certainly have a phenomenon now with overdiagnosis of autism in the same way that we have overdiagnosis of ADHD, attention deficit, hyperdeficit. Pardon me, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. You know, and I it's not that I presume that it's not a real problem. I think that autism is a real problem. And whatever name you're going to call it under, people certainly struggle with inattentiveness and hyperactivity, and we have to make up a name for that, apparently. But the extent to which these things become just patterns of behavior leading to a diagnosis that changed someone's life forever without, for example, an MRI scan, without a physically real, verifiable set of criteria. There is certainly now overdiagnosis of autism. And the only thing I'll say, again, I related already the story of my friend who had a mentally disabled sister. Often the only help the family can get is by achieving a positive test result of that kind. You know, that if his sister qualifies as mentally retarded, they're going to get government help. And if she doesn't, they're proud of her because she studied hard and worked hard and she passed the test, but now you don't get any government help. So, I mean, likewise, a diagnosis, even whether it's autism or attention deficit disorder, or even if it's a completely false diagnosis, that could be helpful to the family because now they're getting forms of support otherwise they wouldn't get with some kid who has some problem, but it may not be autism, it may not be ADHD. Sat12 comments that right-wing demagogues seem to like the concept of meritocracy. And that is because it is a very exotic and foreign concept to them. Yes, meritocracy. It's because it's something they've never experienced and never seen in their lives. That's what makes it seem so appealing. Yeah, so Frida comments, I mean, this is a simple comment, but it's very true, that she has met a person that she thinks is stupid, but he plays the guitar very well. He has a great voice and writes songs. Maybe he is just dumb at everything else, you know? Well, exactly. What if people who are stockbrokers, what if people who make a lot of money on the stock market are dumb at everything else? You know, this is human nature writ large. What can I tell you? So someone else here comments that he knew a security guard who was a member of Mensa. He said he didn't need a lot of money. So if you guys don't know what Mensa is, MENSA, it is basically a special club for people who get very high scores on IQ tests. And they have their own intelligence test, which is normally called the Mensa test. Tell you a short story about that too. I had a friend, and people had always told him he was some kind of a genius. He was some kind of unusually intelligent guy. He now has a PhD. And, you know, I knew him well. He was in some ways a talented person and in some ways not so much. And he applied to join Mensa. He had a series of experiences that kind of led up to this moment in his life where he said, okay, he would take the test to try to join Mensa. And it was something like after 3 weeks, they were supposed to send you the results in the mail. And so he wrote the test, and 3 weeks later, he hadn't gotten any results, and he waits and he waits. And obviously I forget the precise number. It was only like 6 weeks later, he got in touch with them over the phone. And he said, hi, I was wondering, did it get lost in the mail? What happened to test results? And the person on the phone said, yes, you see, we have a policy that we don't like to send the results when the score is quite this low. Because they're afraid that the person would commit suicide, that they'd be so discouraged by getting a low score. Yeah. So if he was just a little bit below, So anyway, Richie says that he knew a security guard who was a member of Mensa, and he said he didn't need a lot of money. Well, okay, let me ask you something. So again, if we're talking about the low end of the spectrum, the middle end of the spectrum, and the supposed high end of the spectrum, you can think about what I did in the last year, guys. Read Appian, read Machiavelli. There's a lot of other books here off camera. Oh, I got Xenophon over here. I've been reading a lot of meaningful things. I've been thinking about a lot of meaningful things. I've been writing. I've been talking about meaningful things. What if I had spent the last year just drilling the Mensa test again and again and again? The word drill is now very rarely used this way. It used to be used that way all the time in English. Sorry, if you read stuff from the 1930s or 1950s. By drill, I got an open schedule. I could set an alarm, wake up at 6 a.m., drink Red Bull Cola or something, drink some highly stimulating drink, and every morning at 7 a.m., sit down and write the Mensa test. I could do it every day. Yeah, for a year. I could practice every day doing that kind of problem solving, that kind of written answer. Does anyone here doubt that I could pass the Mensa test or maybe even set a record? I mean, the only reason to be honest with you, the only reason I think I would not set a record is I think there were a whole bunch of guys who already did that. I think they did that. They practiced every day for 10 years or whatever to try to get into the Guinness Book of World Records or something. If you actually practiced this particular set of skills that are reflected on the test. Now, it's been a while since I've looked at test questions for Mensa, but I remember this is an example that stayed with me because it is so peculiar. And it described, a man is walking down the sidewalk with a pair of flat loafers, flat shoes on, and he steps on a bug or a strawberry or something, and it's on the front left side of his shoe. And then when he turns his shoe up to look at it, like what side will it be on relatively? It was one of these things where you had to, in your mind, visualize when the shoe got turned around. And sorry, maybe I'm slightly misremembering the question. Like maybe it's that he stepped on wet paint that was the letter R or something. And then when he turns his shoe up, how was it going to look? It was something like this, where you had to visualize how the image would get turned around in your mind and then answer the question for which way would be up and which way would be down. So this would be very difficult for someone with dyslexia or something. Now, what are you testing here? Are you testing my intelligence? Are you testing my interest in, practicing this particular way of thinking? And guys, sorry, I am self-critical. I haven't been studying Chinese lately. As soon as I finish writing my book, I'm planning to return to studying Chinese in a big way. The particular skills that are involved in Chinese, I would not call kind of good or evil. They're not one or the other. But they have very little to do with reality in the same way. Like, okay, I'm going to practice writing the same character again. I'm going to remember how it sounds. I'm going to remember how to use it in a sentence. I have to ask my lovely assistant to pass me something to drink. I'm not used to performing in this heat. Do you want to give me that? Do you want? Okay, all right. If you were to make a trip to the fridge, you would be exposed on camera. Yeah. Okay. All right. We'll share a jar. So anyway, guys, I honestly, I could tell anecdotes about intelligence tests all day. I think if you've been watching my channel for a million years, like Ron Sims has, you've heard me talk about the intelligence test used by the Canadian military. More recently, I was reading about the intelligence test used by the American military. I read a whole book about that. But I took the intelligence test for the Canadian military myself when I signed up to join the Army. And a lot of the questions were getting at dyslexia. A lot of them were about rotating things and remembering how things are oriented and which way is up and which way is down. Spatial puzzles, geometric spatial puzzles. And apparently I'm good at this, or I'm good enough at it. I've never practiced this in my life. But, you can recognize this. Like if you wanted to set a record and get the highest score anyone had ever gotten on the Canadian intelligence test, you could just practice this. You could just wake up every day and practice doing these stupid puzzles, and they have no applicability to real life. Okay, sorry. Let's be clear. Sorry. I shouldn't say there is zero applicability to real life. This type of puzzle, it eliminates two types of people. One, it eliminates people at that low end that I opened the video talking about. It's so important, right? Like the military really has to eliminate people who can't even read the instructions that are on the cartridge of ammunition, where they can't read things. They're whether due to lack of education or real mental disability, they're not at that level of competence. And again, I read a whole book dealing with what happens when you have people in a battlefield situation who are below that level of mental competence, and it gets real scary. Something like, can you operate a radio while afraid for your life? On a battlefront where there are bullets zipping around you. Can you calmly and with a focused mind operate a radio dial? Some people are too, mentally disabled to do this. No problem. Sorry. We had an off-camera sneeze delaying. And now a word from our sponsor. Anyway. Yeah. On the one hand, the military is testing for this kind of low-end fundamental competency. And then above and beyond that, I did some reading about the Canadian test, and they had a lot of problems with people with dyslexia and people who lacked this kind of spatial awareness, where when you handed them a magazine of bullets to put into a rifle or something, they would put it in upside down and backwards, and they'd stand there for 60 seconds trying to get it to go in. So there are some people apparently, and by the way, that may not be dyslexia, it may be a different condition or problem, but there are some people who will just never get it with the orientation of geometric objects this way, apparently. And that was a special problem they encountered, and they started to design the test to reflect that. So my point was, initially I was suggesting a lot of the things on these tests are really unrelated to competence and intelligence in any meaningful way. However, we should recognize the very limited way in which they may reflect some kind of intelligence or some kind of competence that we might indeed be testing for, whether it's the military or what have you. So Ronald Sims did reply. Ronald wrote back saying, those tests were positive until he graduated high school, and then again when he graduated college. So the state he lives in has complicated rules about the diagnosis of mental illness. Okay, this is interesting to hear, Ron. I would be interested to hear if you believed that the tests were correct or incorrect in the first place. I mean, it's certainly, I've already indicated that I'm open-minded about that, but it is certainly possible in the year 2021 for someone to be diagnosed with autism just because they're a jerk, or just because they were a jerk on the particular day of the test even. It's because a lot of these are just based on observable behavior, and they shouldn't be. But, I've spoken to several people who thought they had autism, and as soon as I started listing off the hard criteria, they were like, oh, what? No, I've never done anything like that. I've never felt that way at all. I was like, well, okay. Looks like you've been reading articles in Cosmopolitan magazine or something. You've been reading magazine articles talking about high functioning autism, and you've been ignoring what the criteria really are supposed to be for establishing someone has the condition. Anyway, as I've already indicated, I have sympathy for people on all sides of that. I think people struggle with diagnoses, and people struggle without them, so, but there are certainly a lot of false positives there. I have not heard a lot of complaints about false negatives with diagnosis for autism. Okay, I'm just reading through your comments here, guys. So anyway, there's a lot of things here, guys. So I'm not saying this to insult you, but a lot of you haven't thought this through enough. Fine, that's why you're here on YouTube. Listen to me. So Sat12 says creativity uses intelligence, but is not synonymous with it. Okay, what's creativity? I already pointed out with the example of pop music that the Rolling Stones, a white British band, imitates Black American music. I mean, directly, their early work, their first album, their first several singles, 100% a knockoff of, an imitation of what African Americans were already doing. And this is considered creative. This is creativity, right? Now, me, I'm a white Jewish person from Toronto. Probably if I, as a fashion designer, started imitating traditional Japanese clothing, this would be perceived as creative. And someone from Japan would say, well, what do you mean? He's just copying what here is a well-established, recognizable thing. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the fashion world is too critical for me to get ahead in this way. Maybe this is an interesting contrast between mainstream rock and roll and what it takes to get ahead and be perceived as creative in fashion. But, the perception of creativity, what we measure as, what we refer to as creativity. Well, if imitation can be perceived as creativity, what isn't? What's not creativity? So the idea that we can calibrate any test or even just an evaluation of someone's character as to how creative they are is certainly a very difficult thing. So, okay, another great question. Plant-based Powered asked, do you think vegan gains is intelligent? So this is a digression, but it's not too much of a digression. So I've known Richard for years, and obviously we stopped talking after he and his wife decided they hated my guts. As I recall, I think his wife hated me first, and she was really against me, and it took him about a year to catch up with her or something. But I have known of Richard, and I've known Richard, and I've interviewed Richard and so on. So today in 2021, of course, Richard's a stupid person because he lives his life in a stupid way, right? Now, the question that's really challenging and hard to deal with is how intelligent could Richard be today if he had stopped making excuses for himself, say 7 years ago? I think I first got to know Richard about 7 years ago now. I don't want to simplify this too much, but what if Richard had stopped playing video games? He had just reached a point in his life 7 years ago where he said, well, this is something I did in my childhood, but it's now meaningless. It's holding me back. I'm going to stop playing video games. What if Richard had stopped doing bodybuilding and weightlifting? He thought, well, this used to be a part of my life, but it's just holding me back. Now, there's a much broader and deeper sense in which I can ask, what if he stopped making excuses? He could have developed in many different ways. One of his interests, obviously, had to do with the health sciences. He could have gotten formal education in the health sciences, even in food science or nutrition or what have you. There are many different ways he could have developed. He obviously is someone who's always had an interest in politics. He could have really become a very well-educated person in politics. 7 years is a long time. He could have developed himself in many ways. That's what we don't know. And one of the reasons why, it's not one of the reasons. The reason why I judge others so harshly is precisely that I'm an optimist in this way. It's precisely that I still believe in their positive intellectual potential. Now, another example, so we just talked about Richard, vegan gains. Another example is Jacqueline Glenn. So I've probably known about Jacqueline Glenn for 10 years. So I think it's even longer than Richard, She and I have never spoken, unlike Richard. However, we have communicated with each other indirectly. She has made YouTube videos responding to me. I have made YouTube videos, but it is quite clear that she knows my work. And I know her work also. Of course, today in 2021, it's very easy to say Jacqueline Glenn is an imbecile. She's an idiot. Why is she stupid? Because she lives her life in a stupid way. And after years, it catches up with her. But to ask that question, where could she be today? What was she capable of intellectually? If 10 years ago she'd quit drinking, quit smoking marijuana, quit using drugs like ayahuasca, quit making excuses and really devoted herself in any which way to developing herself intellectually. I mean, I'm not presuming one narrow path. She could have read Appian for all I care. I mean, whatever. She could have gone into classical Greek and Latin. She could have done anything. And sorry, so let's be clear. When I talk about someone like Jacqueline Glenn, why do I have this optimism? Well, I don't think she's in that lower end of the spectrum where you're evaluating someone to see whether or not they can be competent to testify in court. I mean, she's someone who fundamentally has all the working parts required to be an intelligent person, but she didn't make any of the decisions necessary to become an intelligent person. She didn't make any of the sacrifices necessary to become an intelligent person. And there are sacrifices. It comes at a price. That's Becky. Well, I'm using up fluids over here. I don't know if you. But yeah, anyway, I hope you guys. This is one of the great things about live streaming and about making videos is that I think you guys can feel my sincerity in saying this stuff. Like I'm not just hating on her or insulting her or something. That it actually comes out of a position of real, sympathy or empathy. And I think the reverse argument could be true of me also. I wonder all the time, what if I joined the army when I was younger? I mean, if I had joined the army at 18 years old, like maybe it would have really arrested my intellectual development. I would have ended up being an idiot for the rest of my life. Really, I am not joking. I really wonder if I had made just slightly different choices in my education and my career, how much stupider I could have turned out now as an old man. And I'll never know that either. If I'd continued drinking and womanizing, something I basically only did when I was 16 years old or 17 years old or so. I mean, my interest in that ran out really quickly. But, I believe me, my father encouraged me. My father completely assumed that I was going to remain a alcohol drinking womanizer for the rest of my life. And plenty of his other sons did, but no, I mean, I moved over, I got over it and moved on. But I could be an idiot today if I continued living that way. So I say it with that sympathy. And again, I have to look at these other people I've known in my life. My own brothers, my own sisters, and just my contemporaries, people who went through school with me. And I can see how they've lived, and I see how they've turned out. And if they'd made different choices, just over 5 years. If you're really working hard, 5 years is a long time. And sorry, and again, let me just say, I say this to Melissa all the time. With Melissa, I know I'm talking about 4 years rather than 5 years. But I say all the time, look, I've learned so much in the last 4 years. I'm really aware of it. Like, my sophistication, my level of education, my level of understanding. I learned a lot just in the last 4 years. I didn't stop learning, when I finished high school or university or something. So that goes both ways. I'm also aware of how much more ignorant I was 4 years ago, 8 years ago, 12 years ago, so yeah, I'm sorry. I realize this is a long answer to a short question, but that really is my sincere answer. When we're talking about people who are in the middle range, people who aren't dealing with fundamental disabilities that impair their ability to read, their ability to even sit in a chair. I've known people with nervous system conditions, where they have seizures and jumping and they can't sit and read for that reason. You can have all kinds of disabilities that really limit how well you can develop yourself and so on. But when we're talking about the middle range, sure, I'm fundamentally incredibly optimistic about what people like Vegan Gaines could have done with their minds, what people like Jacqueline Glenn could have done with their minds. And that's part of why I judge them so harshly for having squandered tremendous opportunities that many of you in the audience, don't have and will never have. I mean, I know just poverty and being busy all the time, I'll just say this, okay? Examples were held up to me as a young man of people who were poor and busy and hardworking and who nevertheless hit the books and developed and cultivated themselves intellectually and lived that meaningful life. And I think my parents didn't realize how this would backfire because I just completely bought into it. I was like, well, of course. I was like, oh, well, of course. So you can work on a construction site and read, you can read Appian on the bus on the way to the demolition job, of course you can. And, it's true of me. I'm that kind of guy. You know what I mean? I know it's incredibly rare. And, I was given these other examples I won't say who it was. There was a virtuous, a virtuous waitress in an old fashioned diner. And she educated herself. I think she got a master's degree while waiting tables. I don't think she got a PhD, but she got a master's degree. And, she didn't remain devoted to life of the mind while doing this kind of, unglamorous, not intrinsically intellectual work. And, of course, you're not stressed out by that kind of job. You're not run down. Of course you can do the right. And, my parents were completely horrified when, during my own university education, I was talking about this as my own future, that I was going to finish, my university degree. And I applied for a job working on a demolition crew in construction. This is the work I was applying for. I formally applied to become a bricklayer. So that it's a little more complicated. You don't apply for the job. You apply to get into a kind of training program, which is linked to a construction site. You do the training, and within like 3 days, you're doing the job. It's not like going to university. You get like 3 days, kind of unpaid work, and then you're on the thing. That was the stuff I was applying for, and I talked about becoming a postal worker and things. And my parents were completely horrified. I could say they had to admit to themselves, but nobody has to admit to themselves. But I mean, I think on some level they weren't comfortable with the extent to which they assumed I would pursue a life of bourgeois success and bourgeois education. and that I wouldn't take seriously, that no, that type of accomplishment is really meaningless. And, they'd proven it to me, and I'd seen it all around me in the site. I knew how worthless master's degrees and PhDs were. I really knew how worthless the university system was. It was like, well, this is what awaits me, is a life, whether as a bricklayer or as the other one, you guys probably know this, but was becoming an EMT, an emergency medical technician, which basically means you work in an ambulance, And my parents were horrified. They totally opposed this. They actually intervened to prevent me from getting any of these jobs. They freaked out. I mean, if my father were alive, I don't know. I guess he'd deny it or something. I should be interested to see how he'd react to being confronted with this. But they were incredibly, they were not at peace with themselves in dealing with it. I just have to say they were really in this very strange kind of cognitive dissonance situation where it's like they taught me all this stuff, kind of glorifying the humble life of the proletariat. If you don't know the word proletariat, don't look it up. It's a communist catchphrase, but being the working class, poor, honest person who doesn't care about getting a master's degree and a PhD, but who cares about being a real intellectual and ideally being a real revolutionary too, or something, being a real political dissident. And for me, I took that on sincerely that they never had. And then they were shocked when I was talking about getting a job on a demolition crew. I thought it was a great job. Also, I like to work out, I like to exercise, but in those days, not a gym. I was not into going to formal gyms. I do push-ups and chin-ups and things, but I wouldn't go to a gym. I thought, well, this is great. I can build up my physical strength, doing a job that's not mentally exhausting, but it's physically exhausting, and then I can do all this other stuff. Anyway, sorry. Again, a long answer to a simple question, but what can I tell you? It's I thought this was worth speaking on. All right. So yeah, there's a quotation here. Sorry, quotation. There's a question here. Sat12 says, nobody says Mick Jagger or Keith Richards are particularly intelligent, like Stephen Hawking or Einstein. Right, this is true, but you see how easy it is for musicians to present themselves as slightly mysterious and then ineffably brilliant, right? Pardon me. So there are also innumerable musicians who really just by remaining silent at interviews through long and meaningful pauses. I think Bob Dylan himself is an example of that, where people create this intellectual mystique around Bob Dylan, even though there's no reason to think he's intelligent anyway whatsoever, including his views on religion, by the way. Just continuing to read your questions here. Oh, okay. All right. So intelligence tests and the politicization of the concept of quantifiable intelligence. The first and most fundamental thing is to talk about how intelligence tests are quantified at the low end of the spectrum. Well, point zero was to draw our attention to the gap between subjective and objective measures of intelligence. And for the most part, subjectively, when we think someone's intelligent, it's just because they have a lot in common with us. If somebody states the same political beliefs you happen to hold, you're inclined to regard them as intelligent. If you meet someone who sincerely supports Donald Trump, someone who sincerely supports George W. Bush, your first assumption will probably be that they are stupid if you oppose these people politically. It might take quite a lot of evidence to convince you that instead they are brilliant but evil. Think about how difficult it would be to convince you today, or if you got in a time machine and went back to the period of George W. Bush, how difficult would it be for me to convince you that the protesters, sorry, was it January 9th? I got the date wrong. January 6th. January 6th, 2021, the protesters who were supporting Donald Trump, that these people were not stupid, that they were not naive, that they were not manipulated by rumors on the internet, et cetera, but that in fact, like particular people in this crowd, in particular ordinance, that in fact they were brilliant but evil, brilliant but had bad intentions. It's very difficult for us to. Now, maybe we can present some evidence. Maybe one of those people can turn around and show you their IQ score, show you their Mensa membership. I doubt it. But, my point is we have this very, very powerful inclination to evaluate people's intelligence really just in terms of how much they have in common with us. And when they don't have things in common with us, ethically, morally, politically, even aesthetically, even style of clothing, people are dressed in a way you find funny and don't sympathize with, we will judge them to be stupid. And it will take quite a lot to convince you that they are intelligent or brilliant, but they have their own strong reasons for why they disagree with you on these things. And those reasons may be idiosyncratic, they may be eccentric, or they may actually be evil. Another interesting digression here. Plant-based, shall I read your full name? Plant-based Powered asks, do you think JFK was intelligent? So I'll just say this about that. When you're judging the intelligence of historical figures, whether it be JFK or, say, Napoleon, it's very important to consider the man's whole life. And I think, I was tempted to digress into this point in my earlier video where I made the comparison between Bob Dylan and someone who's become a multimillionaire on the stock market doing, hedge fund management. Okay, the fact that someone is a hedge fund manager and that they've made correct decisions in managing the hedge fund and have been paid very handsomely for this role, okay, that tells you something about them. But if you actually get to know this guy, if you listen to him for just 30 minutes talk about his life, perhaps he's going to tell you about, and I gave examples, his first marriage and why his first wife divorced him after he cheated on her sleeping with a stripper. Perhaps, he has a history of having a cocaine habit. Perhaps he's made a long series of really bad choices in his life. And when he tells you about them, you start to reflect, perhaps this person is not so intelligent. Now, this comes back to what I said earlier. Perhaps your reason for judging him as being stupid now is simply that he doesn't have very much in common with you. Perhaps if you had more of those experiences yourself, you'd be inclined to appreciate him more. Perhaps if you also had slept with a stripper and had your wife leave you for that reason, you might sympathize more with, really. I'm joking, but I'm entirely serious. To what extent is this just falling back in the same kind of subjective judgment? In this same way, if you're going to evaluate the intelligence of JFK or Napoleon or any other historical figure like this, you have to kind of behold the man all in all. You can't just look at his accomplishments. You can't just look at what he did in the stock market or whatever. And I do think that Napoleon's sex life tells you a lot about who he really was as a man. Everything about it. You can also read about Napoleon's relationship with his mother and Napoleon's relationship with his brothers and Napoleon's relationship with his kids. I mean, we know a lot about every aspect of that guy's life. Napoleon's relationship with black people, let's put it that way. I think, yes, it would take a kind of brilliant, free-thinking man to live in that culture at that time and really conclude that racism against black people was bad and evil and wrong. But guess what? There were men around like that. There were guys like Condorcet who were alive who figured out that enslaving black people was bad and evil and wrong, and that black people were fundamentally equal. It didn't take a genius. Another one, of course, is, for example, anti-Semitism. Who figured out and who didn't the extent to which anti-Semitism is bullshit in that culture. Even if there's a kind of intelligence test there, that's a good way to put it. It would have been an intelligence test for Napoleon to, overcome the prejudice against black people in his society. But other people in that society were intelligent enough to overcome that prejudice. In the same way, if you know someone in a predominantly Muslim, predominantly anti-Semitic society where they're raised surrounded by anti-Semitic messages, like on television from news broadcasters all the time and from their own family, nevertheless, some of those people are going to be intelligent enough to overcome those things. But anyway, sorry, I'm digressing to illustrate. But my point is, if you want to know how intelligent someone like JFK was or someone like Napoleon was, you look at the person's whole life. And in both cases, frankly, JFK and Napoleon, I think you come to some pretty dismal conclusions. One final note on that too, though, also with hedge fund managers, how much of their accomplishments in life are truly their own accomplishments. With modern painters in the 21st century, there was a scandal a while back because it was revealed that a certain modern artist, most of his painting wasn't done by him. He employed painters to paint the things he was asking them to paint. And he responded to this controversy by completely dismissing it as an old-fashioned concern. He said no. He said he thinks of himself as a conceptual artist, and sometimes he does sculpture and sometimes he does installations. And when he does paintings, he asks other people to do the actual work, but that's not what matters. It's his idea. He's the one in charge. He is a kind of executive producer's role, like in cinema. And so, this is of no significance whatsoever. But, we presume when we look at a painting that we know the man, we know the one man who did all the work. That may not be true. It may be a whole studio of people work together to produce this painting. Well, if you think the brilliance of Napoleon is proven by his legal reforms, the Code Napoleon, I got news for you. He's barely responsible for 2 sentences of it. I mean, I give Napoleon no credit at all for the Code Napoleon. I mean, probably a little bit of credit is deserved for him, but he really, that's really not his work, but his name is on it. He presided over the finalization of that set of legal reforms. It started long before he came to power, and it was a very different set of people who were really the authors and the negotiators who created it. I rest my case. But, obviously it is not easy to attribute any accomplishment to JFK whatsoever. That's just, what is it you would attribute to JFK and say that he did of his own brilliance or of his own intelligence, as opposed to being other people surrounding him? All right, I'm just reading your. All right, so another great question. Sorry, it's good, guys. I like doing these things spontaneously. I mean, you could probably tell I could have done this video just as one continuous monologue. Somebody asks, quote, do you think IQ is inherited because parents have learning disabilities? Okay, so I'm sorry, I slightly rephrased your question. Okay. This is precisely what the right-wing demagogues try to weaponize into a political platform, right? So some disabilities are hereditary, not all, right? So some distortions in your IQ statistics will show up as being hereditary. Now, you guys probably know certain impairments of vision are hereditary. For example, certain things that will impact your ability to learn and achieve things in life are hereditary disabilities, and others are not. Others are, for example, caused by a nutritional deficiency. Some disabilities are caused by a car accident, including mental disabilities. I knew someone who had her head caved in a car accident and had reconstructive surgery, but she qualified as mentally disabled forever after. So I'm just saying you can be mentally disabled for reasons that are not genetic and not hereditary, right? But again, something I warned about in my earlier video is the extent to which tests that exist for and are calibrated for evaluating people at the low end of the spectrum are misrepresented in politics as if they're meaningful for the full spectrum. Now, I knew one guy who told me that his mother had been a crack addict during pregnancy. I knew one very different guy who told me that his father had been a heroin addict right up to his conception and birth, but I think not his mother. The effects on the intellectual development of a child, if the parents are drug addicts, especially the mother during pregnancy, but even if not during pregnancy, what if the mother becomes a drug addict 6 months after she gives birth to the kid? Well, she's still a drug addict in terms of the whole parenting and nurturing role thereafter. Obviously, any of us would expect that a meaningful test of intelligence, which the IQ may not be, but a meaningful test of intelligence is going to show negative effects from this, right? And again, if just talking it through in 2 sentences, you can immediately understand what that is and understand that it's not an argument that supports scientific racism or anything else. But it's an argument that immediately draws our attention to incredibly important social problems that if we don't solve, rapidly get worse and saddle us with a huge population of people who've grown up in deprived circumstances and, can barely participate in our society and so on. And by the way, it's a huge problem here in Canada. I mean, drug addiction is at epidemic levels. And we have kids who grew up, even if the kids do not become drug addicts themselves, they grow up in an incredibly depressed, incredibly deprived state because their parents are drug addicts or alcoholics or both, And this is not a black issue and it's not a white issue. You ever heard of Ireland? I mean, there are plenty of white people in Ireland who are alcoholics and drug addicts. You can go to countries where all these problems exist and they're not divided on racial lines, You ever been to South Korea? Wow, what a culture of alcoholism South Korea has. Anyway, sorry. Somebody in the comments says that his girlfriend is fetal alcohol syndrome. Well, and your girlfriend admits it. That's the more rare thing. Fetal alcohol syndrome is at epidemic levels in Canada. I remember an important article back during the peak of the hysteria over HIV/AIDS. I remember reading an article here in Canada that was saying, look, when you really consider the numbers honestly, Canada doesn't have an AIDS problem. We have a fetal alcohol syndrome problem. Alcohol drinking mothers during pregnancy, that's a real epidemic that's going to, ruin the next generation. And just the number of people who have AIDS and the number of babies being born with AIDS, this is a really small problem, numerically. So anyway, great comment from the audience. Hashtag Irish sobriety. Anyway, guys, so look, it's great talking to you guys. And I think I've covered a lot of the ground kind of spontaneously in this way. If you guys have more questions, ask more questions, because I do enjoy answering them. If more of you guys could hit the thumbs up button, it'll help more people discover the video. I do think my YouTube channel is pretty thoroughly shadow banned right now. If you guys are members of Patreon, I posted this screenshot, I forget, yesterday, the day before yesterday. Oh, you know what? That's actually on my blog too. So here, you can see it if you're not a Patreon subscriber. I just said, look, if this isn't permissible, what is? If this is the level of censorship and the limitation on freedom of speech we're going to deal with on YouTube, what am I supposed to do here, guys? But anyway, yeah. If you guys hit thumbs up, it helps more people discover the live stream, especially while we're still going. Oh, if someone joins now, I don't think they'd be too confused about what it is we're talking about. Frankly, I think you could jump right in here at the 56-minute mark and understand what it is I'm going on about with no problem at all. Okay, so what I've been hinting at, having established, do you mind elaborating on that CBC picture you posted on the blog? You're going to have to fill me in on the details. I'm not sure which one you're talking about. Perfectly reasonable question. All right, sorry, back to the topic here.
I think you meant like the right wing, left wing.
Okay. Yeah, Melissa has filled in the blanks for us. Yeah, well, that whole video itself. So yeah, it's satirical, but nevertheless contains profound and disturbing wisdom. So there you go. The taxonomy of Canadian democracy image. There you go. I'll provide the link for anyone in the audience who wants to be in on the inside joke there. Okay, guys. So I've already talked about the extent to which a lot of the right-wing demagoguery about IQ statistics relies on us suspending our disbelief and pretending that problems at the low end of the spectrum are problems throughout the whole spectrum. And I've formally studied social science statistics, but this will be immediately apparent to you. If you don't disaggregate data, what does this fancy word disaggregate mean? Separating the data into columns, into separate segments, whatever we're going to use here, then it's going to be tremendously misleading. If you have, so look, I just mentioned you could do this with neighborhood rather than ethnicity, right? If instead of looking at the contrast between black students and white students getting into universities, obviously, if you looked at wealthy neighborhoods versus poor neighborhoods, you could look at all the disadvantages poor white people have in contrast to poor black people and whatever. You can disaggregate the data in other ways. And yes, it may be that when you're looking at poor households and poor families, you're looking at more people who have some of these disadvantages that put them into the bottom end of the spectrum. But once you've removed this, once you're evaluating people who are in the middle or people on the top, you're suddenly not looking at any of these considerations anymore. You're not looking at the question of whether or not someone is, for example, mentally capable of doing military service. We're now asking questions about whether you would make a good architect or a great architect. Now, that is something very, very different to try to test for, to try to calibrate a test to say, look, do you really have the potential not to sit at a desk and listen to a lecture and take notes at all, right? Like that's a serious area of scientific research, a serious area of public policy. Look, some people, whether through mental disability or lack of education or disadvantaged circumstances or injury or what have you, some people are not capable of attending classes and looking at what's on the board and listening to the professor and taking notes and then later writing an essay. So, okay, that's one way to calibrate the test. But you are telling me that you are going to create a test that instead is going to evaluate people in the middle or people at the high end to talk about what kind of intellectual potential they have, whether they would be a good architect or whether they would be a great architect. So now we come back to the fundamental question here of why. Okay, let's repeat the original question that started the video. Right? What would be a meaningful test of intelligence, right? So we have disaggregated this. There are meaningful tests at the low end. It really matters, like whether or not you have dyslexia, whether or not you have other mental disabilities that, again, may disqualify you from doing military service even. It may disqualify you from all kinds of jobs, may disqualify you from college. But now you want to talk about a military test, pardon me. You want to talk about a meaningful test of intelligence that will separate someone who will only ever be a mediocre architect from someone who has the potential to be a great architect. Now, why do you want to devise this test? Presumably, it's because you only have 40 seats available. You can only admit 40 students into your University of Architecture, and you want only the students who really have the potential to be great architects, not just good architects. Interesting. Look, here's this. Does anyone in the audience believe this is really? Does anyone believe this? This is kind of coming down to the myth of meritocracy. Colleges want money. They want students who can pay money. If you're terrible at it, that's better because you're not going to ask any questions. You're not going to cause any problems to the professor. They don't want brilliant architects. If you're a brilliant architect, don't even come to our school. Oh, great. You're brilliant. Go make your fortune. Go have a great career. The attitudes that actually exist in these institutions are not at all of trying to encourage or recruit the people who have the best research. Okay, but if you were to devise now, so if you're going to devise a meaningful test, let's ask what that is. But can we all admit to ourselves, if you wanted to weed out, if you wanted to remove the people who would only ever be a good architect and not a great architect, does anyone believe the IQ test would establish this difference? Anyone? Does anyone believe that the type of math puzzles and logic puzzles and geometry puzzles in the IQ test is going to distinguish the difference between someone, not someone who currently is a good architect versus a great architect, but someone who has the potential in future to become a great architect? And all you guys know right now, if we round up the 20 most successful architects, and again, what makes a great architect? We had a long discussion for, what is creativity, right? Like, how do you measure? Maybe if I, as a white Canadian, start imitating traditional Japanese pagodas, traditional Japanese temple architecture, people will regard me as tremendously creative. They might even think I'm a great architect. And someone from Japan says, what, this is like a second-rate ripoff of our traditional architecture. What are you guys getting excited about? It's very believable. Things like that happen to architecture all the time. Oh, so the fact that I'm successful, therefore means I'm creative and therefore means I'm intelligent. It doesn't. It does. The fact that somebody got rich on Bitcoin doesn't mean they're intelligent, guys. The fact that someone got rich on the stock market, and it's not even necessarily luck, right? You can get rich on the stock market just because you got good advice and you followed it. Someone told you would make money if you bought this stock, and you believed them and listened to them and bought the stock. It's all it takes to be successful in the stock market, right? Anyway, okay. So, is it possible to test someone's current potential to become a great architect? Is it possible to evaluate the difference between mediocre, good, and great architects, people who've already become, let's say they're all 55 years old. They're toward the end of their career. Well, architects can work till 75, I guess. At age 55, after they've already had decades of work in the field, if we gave them an IQ test, do you think this measure of so-called intelligence is going to distinguish them? If we gave them the U.S. military's intelligence test or the Canadian military's intelligence test, or great example, what if we, at age 55, we got these distinguished architects and we forced them to write the SAT test again? We forced them to write the university entrance test again. They'd be always sitting there going, oh, I don't remember any of this stuff. This crap I was forced to learn in high school that I've never used as an adult, never used. And now you're going to evaluate my intelligence on this basis. This is terrible. I once sat down and I was given a primary school grammar test, for English grammar. And it made me want to never have my kid in a school in Canada. I was like, wow, this is the test used. And it was terrible. And the answers were so poorly phrased. I didn't know the answers. It was so unclear and obfuscatory. It's like, which one of these is the best example of irony? And like all 5 examples are terrible. It's like, do you think any of this is a good use of irony? Like, do you know the meaning? I know the meaning of the word irony. it's a grammar test. I think for grade 6 students or something. Anyway, just saying. But if you in the audience were forced to go and write a test for school children or a test for college, you might not seem so intelligent to distinguish that. But when we're talking about the middle range and the upper range, what are meaningful tests of intelligence, right? And the simplest answer, again and again and again, is to make the test resemble the type of competence you want to measure, and to admit to yourself that measures of competence will never be measures of intellectual potential. They will only and always be measures of your present capability, created through past hard work and to some limited extent innate talent, I suppose. Not that we can ever disentangle those two. How much of this is hard work? If you want to test how good someone is at flying an airplane, what do? Do you give them an IQ test? Would anyone here want to choose a pilot or trust a pilot or treat someone as a reliable, safe pilot and risk your life? Oh, yeah, man, here's my IQ test. Here's my Mensa test. Oh, yeah, this question on the Mensa test of like, if you take your shoe off, turn it upside down and backwards, and then look at the letter on it, which way is up on the letter? Yeah, bro. I practiced every morning. I woke up in the morning and did these geometry puzzles. I got this great score in my IQ test. I got this great score on my Mensa test. Can you fly a plane, bro? Really? What do we do? What do we do to test that someone can be a pilot? We put them in a computer simulation. It looks like a metal box on 4 crooked legs. It's this box, and when you're in it, it shifts around to give you the feeling of an airplane shifting. And we test them again and again and again in a simulation that resembles a real aircraft as much as humanly possible. The actual steering wheel and the buttons, everything's the same. The test mimics the real challenge. We talked years ago on this channel about a test that was trying to pin down so-called critical thinking. What is critical thinking? How do you measure critical thinking? What do they do? This is also related to airplanes, coincidentally. Well, they gave students a set of 8 or 12 newspaper articles about airplane safety and what to do about airplane crashes. And each article was kind of advancing a different perspective, a different possible proposal to amend what the American government was doing about airplane safety. And each of them had different advantages and disadvantages. It's like, well, we could probably reduce the number of airplanes crashing by 2 or 3 airplanes a year if we did this. However, it would delay each aircraft taking off by 20 minutes. And a 20-minute delay equals so many $1 million per year, this kind of thing. So you can imagine it was presenting a complex, unclear set of considerations. And the student was asked to sit down, read all these articles in whatever order they wanted. They weren't numbered 1 to 10. It's like, look at all the articles. And then here's a series of questions where you have to make an informed evaluation of what the government should do. You have to write a kind of set of policy recommendations, balancing different contradictory information. I think also some of the articles contradict each other. Like some articles said the other article is lying, kind of thing. Oh, well, the other article says, is this intelligence? Is this critical thinking? What are you measuring here? Now, I think probably based on that description, all of you people could say, oh, well, this is a meaningful test of something. Coming back to the example of that taxi driver, the guy who drives the taxi and has these political opinions, maybe he would not do well on that test. You know what I mean? Like maybe he's not the kind of guy who can sit down and give you a balanced, nuanced, analytical view of a bunch of complex, overlapping, mutually contradictory information. Each piece of information has advantages and disadvantages. It's not like, oh, there's one simple solution to this problem, and you have to say what it is. And there are 4 options, A, B, C, D. Which one is the correct answer? Well, there is no correct answer. The question is, how correctly can you argue your point of view and support it given complex, contradictory, uncertain information? Right? So now we're getting into meaningful tests of intelligence. They have to be meaningful relative to some goal, relative to some outcome, relative to some form of competence, right? And for that same reason that we have to recognize the gap between present competence and intellectual potential, or what we think of as this static entity called intelligence. Yeah, someone in the audience is using the term general intelligence. That's what the proponents of the IQ test like to use, and pretend that there's this innate characteristic that's measurable intelligence. Now, again, general intelligence at the low end, when we're calibrating for mentally disabled people to figure out how disabled they are, whether or not they can speak in court, of course that matters. Of course it does. Okay. If I take 10 people from the audience right now and I have you write a series of tests, it doesn't really matter if we do the IQ tests. We do some set of tests to say, okay, we're going to do this intelligence test, guys. And then I'm going to decide who among you has the potential to be a great architect. All right, so we got 10 people out of the audience, and you don't have time to prepare to write the test, right? You write the test, say, okay, guess what, guys? We got winners and losers. You, and you. You three people, you got the highest scores. You're going to be great architects. We're going to take you, we're going to put you into this architecture program, okay? So 7 people fail the test and 3 people pass. Out of the 7 people who failed, right, there are different ways you can respond to this, right? But we all know one of them is, I'll show you. I'll show you who's going to be a great architect. I'm going to work 10 times as hard. And think about this. If you came to that moment in your life where you write this intelligence test and you fail and someone tells you you're never going to be a great architect, do you think the rational thing to do is for you to double down and study twice as hard for that intelligence test? Knowing that the intelligence test has absolutely nothing to do with the type of competence or the type of creativity necessary to be a great architect, or the type of experience. There's also just hands-on workplace experience. Like if you say to yourself, okay, I've got 1 year now, I've got a gap year between high school and college, and I want to go and be a great architect. Do you think you should take that 1 year to travel the world and visit important buildings and learn about architecture? Or do you think you should spend that 1 year practicing every day for the SAT test and the IQ test, for these kinds of standardized tests? Who do you think is going to be a better architect? And sorry, let's just say it's not just tourism. You guys might not have seen this. I've seen this when I've traveled. I go to very strange places. But like I've sometimes been to Buddhist temples or even modern architecture, and there's a guy there who's he's like a tourist, but he's sitting there with a professional drawing board doing the elevation plan. He's really studying the architecture. He's really studying. He's taking sketches and taking notes on how the different parts of the building fit together. Like if you're really interested in the structural aspects of architecture, you can go there, you can see that, you can get motivated, you can get inspired, you can learn about these different things. And then, when you're in the architecture program of the university, you can say to the professor, like you listen to the professor, say, well, that's interesting. But when I was in Milan, what I noticed was this, like you actually have some experience that's relevant to architecture, right? Who is going to be the better architect? The person who studies for 1 year, drilling, doing the questions again and again to get a great SAT test, to get a really high test on the IQ test. Maybe we can throw in the Mensa test. They have a really high score on the Mensa test, or someone who's out learning about architecture. We could throw in also, what about someone who spends a year working in construction? Let's say his uncle has a construction company. He's actually getting hands-on experience with structural steel, with how the actual process of building something works, and then he's going to be able to apply that knowledge. Maybe that guy, maybe it's not 1 year, maybe it's 10 years. Maybe he spent 10 years working construction, and maybe this particular guy has been 10 years in a construction site. Maybe he's not real good at writing IQ tests. Maybe he's not real good at writing the SATs. Maybe he doesn't have a lot of patience for it because he has real life experience, hands-on experience with what architecture really means. And then you sit him down and say, okay, well, we want you to do this bunch of geometric puzzles. We want you to answer a bunch of logic questions and completely meaningless, questions that supposedly test your intelligence. And he's sitting there just pissed off. Man, I don't even want to spend 5 minutes dealing with this because he feels confident. He knows what architecture is. He knows what the job is. He's not going to let this test judge. People can just have that attitude and do badly on the test, right? Okay, but I'm saying this to reach out to you in the audience and say, if you wrote this test, you might feel one of these ways, and maybe not. Maybe out of the 7 people who failed, one of them just believes in the test. They just say, well, I've heard Jordan Peterson talk about IQ tests. I've heard Jordan Peterson talk about the SAT test, and this really judges me, and that's it. This piece of paper has established that I don't have what it takes to be a great architect, so I'm out. And they would just internalize that self-doubt and self-hatred, and they would just consider themselves permanently inferior and permanently disadvantaged and incapable of getting over the hump. right? But some of you, some of those people out of the 10 people, some of you would respond to this and say, damn it, I'm going to be a better architect than those 3 losers who won the test. They know how to write this test, but I know how to design a building. I know how to make a window look beautiful, whatever it is. I know how to assemble, structural steel into something that people really want to live in and people really want to buy. I'm going to make my mark in the world of architecture. And maybe that person goes to a second-rate college, and maybe they go to a third-rate college instead of going to a more expensive college, or instead of having and maybe they succeed anyway. Maybe their brilliance, their acumen, their hard work pays off, right? And if it doesn't, do you really think the people who try and fail, do you think any of them have to say that they just weren't smart enough? In any field of endeavor, how many people try to make it in architecture and fail, or the outcomes are mediocre, and they just say, you know what the problem was? I just didn't have what it took to do these math puzzles. I didn't have what it took to score so high, in these on-paper tests. Okay, guys, that's the conclusion of my video for me. I mean, if you guys have any more questions, I'm happy to take them, and then we can wrap it up. Gizaru writes in saying that some white people in his area weaponize ideas of IQ against Native Americans, specifically as a reason that we shouldn't care about them politically. I wonder if you've noticed this elsewhere. So yes, Gizaru, that is sort of the ultimate taboo in Canadian politics, I would say. I don't know how things are in Alaska, by contrast, or different parts of the United States, where the same issues could exist. So I'll say something about First Nations, our Indigenous people, and then I'll contrast this to a totally different situation on the other side of the world that's nevertheless relevant. So I'm going to give you one specific example, but this happened throughout the Canadian administration of First Nations. There was a reservation in Saskatchewan where the Canadian government separated the Native people living on that reservation into the people they considered genetically superior and the people they considered genetically inferior. And they gave them separate land, and as a social experiment tried to prove that within the Native population there was this kind of eugenic difference in racial superiority. And so, to my knowledge, this wasn't a special area of study for me, but as you can understand, it's a highly politically contentious and interesting area for researchers and historians today. They pretended that these people were selected on the basis of objective tests like IQ tests for their intelligence, but to a large extent, these so-called superior people were selected because they more resembled white Europeans. That it was primarily a racist criterion of who was superior and who was inferior. And it had terrible consequences for those Native people themselves and for their descendants who are still alive today. So there was one specific experiment like that in Saskatchewan that I knew a fair bit about. How many experiments of that kind were there throughout the British Empire? The idea, and we had, without getting into the whole history of our residential school system, but yes, throughout the British Empire, the idea that you could use IQ tests to decide, policy for conquered peoples, it's not that really that it has a long history. It's just that history, it's not that many hundreds of years. I mean, it's not. We're talking about the last 100 years, maybe 150 years or something. It doesn't go back that far, but that's it, the shadow of that still hangs over politics today. And, again, something I didn't talk about this video. It could be a whole separate video. One of the reasons, the most important reasons why IQ does not equal intelligence is just that your motivation and your attitude at the time you write the test, it reflects so much in the score. The same person can write the IQ test 3 months apart and get totally different scores. And any of you can relate to that. If you, a great example, I won't digress into this long. When you have people who are applying to enter the diplomatic service in almost any country, Canada, United States, England, you get people who are highly professional, highly trained, highly educated, highly motivated, and they're applying for a job that they imagine at least will be very high paying. and you get people who are incredibly focused. So, for example, you have a test for diplomats for how well they speak Chinese. Like this is here in Canada. How well do you speak Chinese, or how well do you speak Italian or something? And you have these kind of superhuman performances. These people seem to learn languages in 3 months. Now, this is an illusion, but you can imagine these people are really motivated and so on. And some tests in some circumstances, you have people who are extremely highly motivated to write an IQ test in some reason. But you have people who are demoralized and really literally oppressed, being forced to write intelligence tests, for example, in the history of our First Nations and so on. People who resent being there. People say, why am I being forced to take this test? And where there is no reward. I mean, I just say there are factors like that too to be considered. This is for all discussion of intelligence tests and aptitude tests and so on. And it's, again, I find it difficult to imagine that people are being sincerely incompetent in ignoring those factors, how different the issue of motivation. And again, the same person can write the same test a few months apart and double their score and quadruple their score and they'll say why. Well, they'll say, the first time I didn't care. And then the second time I went and I studied and I prepared and I took it seriously. And, it's not so mysterious. But, if you think this is measuring an innate trait, an innate ability, this is really ridiculous. Okay, sorry. So I'll just reset the question. So Gizaru is asking about, or Jizaru, perhaps. There's so many ways to pronounce your name. This member of the audience is asking about the weaponization of IQ tests against Native Americans. I used to live in Cambodia. Okay. Cambodians get much lower scores on intelligence tests than people from Thailand next door, people from Vietnam on the other side. Now, the actual tests that were being used at that time were not IQ tests. They were math and language aptitude tests. I think, honestly, they're based ultimately on a Japanese standard, not a European standard. But there were some kind of standardized school tests that were given to some people to measure how awful the education system was in Cambodia. And how stupid and ignorant would you have to be to imagine that you're looking at a genetic difference between Cambodians and Vietnamese people and between Cambodians and Thai people when you're looking at the fact that Cambodians at that time were performing much worse on these intelligence tests? It's, again, like, if you actually reify this as if this is a measure of genetics in these people, partly, there's this issue of measuring the low end, measuring the middle, and then measuring the high end, and what our assumptions are built into the high end. What does creativity mean? What does it mean to be a great architect? What does it mean to be a successful stockbroker? And to what extent does being a successful stockbroker or a successful musician like Bob Dylan rely on factors that have nothing to do with your intelligence, especially not hereditary intelligence? All these problems. But in case you hadn't heard, Cambodia was a much more war-torn and poverty-stricken nation than Thailand. And it was even much more war-torn and poverty-stricken than Vietnam. Long story short, the war ended in Vietnam earlier than it ended in Cambodia. Vietnam had a number of other advantages in terms of education and just literacy and what have you. Anyone who had visited these countries and just read a tourist guidebook about the history of these three countries, how could anyone in their right mind think that intelligence test, whether it's the IQ test or, a school aptitude test, how could you think this is reflecting a genetic difference between Cambodians and these other people? Now, beyond that, if you were talking about a real genetic difference between people, what if you had two populations, one population of whom had a higher rate of Down syndrome than the other? And then that's what's showing up in these tests, is the number of people at the bottom end are skewing the test results that way. Hypothetically, you could have that sort of thing. Some genetic disorders. I remember I used to live in Scotland. People were talking all the time about the genetic disorders that the Scottish people had more than anyone else on earth. Yeah, I just mentioned there are a bunch of them. It's just the way DNA works. If you're born Scottish, there are a bunch of problems you have to watch out for that you may have inherited, and they all knew it. And they talked about it. You could have, hypothetically at least, a population of people with a higher rate of Down syndrome babies. And then those babies born with Down syndrome score lower on IQ tests or standardized aptitude tests or school tests. And then that affects your average score. Would you really make a racist argument about genetic inferiority on this basis? What you do with this data, what you make out of this, that's the part that's so it's pseudoscientific, and it's also just fundamentally mean-spirited. So again, I won't digress on this much further, but so with Native Americans, obviously you're looking at these differences in terms of poverty and so on and so forth. But of course, the other one is nutrition. I used to live in Laos. I used to do humanitarian work and research in Laos. Laos is just north of Cambodia, if you hadn't heard. And, there were people who were mentally and physically disabled for life because of lack of vitamin A. They had the vitamin A, and they have impaired vision for the rest of their lives, I think it is. And there were people who were disabled for the rest of their lives by an amazing array of nutritional deficiencies that you just couldn't believe existed in the 21st century. And as I lived there more and I understood the culture, because it wasn't absolute scarcity, guys. It wasn't. I started to understand how it was possible for people to have these nutritional deficiencies that impaired their intellectual development. So there are mangoes everywhere, and you have people eating a 100% meat diet. I'm not joking. I wish I was. You have a culture that doesn't value eating vegetables and fruit, even though they're all, like, poor people can afford to eat mangoes in that climate. And they may even resent it. I remember people saying that to me, that certain kinds of tropical fruit growing, they're like, oh, I was forced to eat this during my childhood because it's cheap, and now I never eat that stuff anymore. It's like, that's how you feel about fruit and vegetables. When people really seriously, where the only food they value is eating buffalo meat, and especially eating raw buffalo meat. And this is in a tropical country with no refrigeration, this kind of mind-blowingly unhealthy diet, And so again, apart from, it's not absolute poverty. It's the combination of poverty and ignorance and cultural values and lack of knowledge of nutrition. But there are nutritional deficits. Oh, sorry. And the ultimate one is, of course, being iodine deficient. You get mental impairment from lack of iodine. And Laos is one of the countries that struggle with that. Mongolia struggled with that. Depending on what's in the diet, iodine deficiency might or might not be an example. So look, this is the tragedy of this. In situations where there really is a sort of quote unquote genetic basis for inequalities in IQ, where it's not as obvious as the difference between Thailand and Cambodia in the 20th century, which has knock-on effects for the 21st century, obviously. Like, it's not as obvious as the difference of whether or not a school exists, whether or not books exist. I'm sorry, but I've lived in these conditions. I met people. I've told the story before. I met a woman. She didn't have a school. She was literally educated in a cave. There was no school. They had one chalkboard. She was educated in a cave by members of the Communist Party while the Americans were dropping bombs outside. Literally, those were her conditions growing up. Anyway, interesting woman too. She eventually got a university degree in Berlin under communism. That was East Berlin, back when there was a separate East Berlin and a West Berlin. Anyway, fascinating character. But obviously these conditions are going to have knock-on effects on IQ scores or university aptitude scores, what have you. And if you actually lived there and worked with them and cared about them and cared for them, you would have some nuanced understanding of what the factors are that with any particular group of Native Americans is, weighing down on their accomplishments academically, shall we say, or in terms of how they get ahead in formal education. And sorry, in Canada, of course, there's also just the quality of the schools themselves, which I could now digress into giving a lecture about. But yeah, obviously the quality of the school you have access to. So no, sorry, long answer to a long question. But look, let's turn it around. Let's argue against my position here. Are Thai people racist against Cambodian people? Yes, they are. Do Thai people commonly believe that Cambodian people are genetically inferior? Yes, they do. Do Thai people routinely say that Cambodians are genetically incapable of higher levels of intelligence? Yes, they do. China versus Mongolia. Do Chinese people commonly believe that Mongolians are genetically inferior, or inferior in terms of IQ, inferior in terms of intelligence? Yes, one of the most widespread forms of racism that exists in China is the belief that Mongolian people are mentally inferior to Chinese people genetically. So to argue against myself, the point is that it is very common in the mass of humanity to make exactly these kinds of racist and racializing judgments. So I suppose this is part of the tragedy of life on planet Earth in the 21st century. So a couple other interesting questions. Obviously, I'm assuming, guys, I'm going to wrap it up. Someone asked, have you seen Sean's video on the bell curve? Yes, as I recall, that was years ago, but yes, I have. And do you follow Nassim Taleb? I did buy and read Nassim Taleb's book 8 years ago, approximately. So that is an interesting factoid. I listened to one of his lectures delivered to the London School of Economics, and I read his book. So deep cuts. Interesting that you asked that. But that is one of the few contemporary authors I have indeed read. So I'm just reading through your questions, guys. Great question. What was the last animal you ate? Really would have to search my memory for that. You know what? I'm thinking. I think I can remember. Actually, I think I can. Anyway. Sorry, there was another great question in here. Oh, so totally different topic, but a great one to speak on briefly. Plant-based power asked, why did we lose the war in Vietnam? Hey, what do you mean we? What do you mean we? Why did we lose the war in Vietnam? He says, we had the technology, or was that war just to make money? So, gee, is there any book I can recommend on this? I don't think so. Sorry, ever so often people ask me for recommendations. Yeah, but I've already mentioned it. It's not on this. It's not on the stuff. Well, you know what, babe? It kind of is. You know what? You're right. I guess this is the book to recommend. Okay, guys, you're gonna see the camera move because this book is underneath the camera here. So yeah, totally off topic, but maybe a nice little digression to end it. So this is a book on the history of the My Lai massacre that I myself like to mispronounce sometime. So there you go. History of the My Lai massacre. And the reality is, with this event being of unique and tremendous historical significance, but this was not the only such event. The United States got demoralized and gave up. It is true that the actual organization of the army was inept. It is true that in many important ways, the Americans were both politically incompetent and tactically incompetent. That is true. However, fundamentally, the Vietnam War stopped when Americans stopped believing in it. They lost faith in the project of the Vietnam War. And I think people could ask quite righteously at many a point during the Vietnam War, what the hell are we fighting for? What was the purpose of this war? And obviously there was a failure on the part of political leaders to actually create a meaningful sense of what the purpose and objective of the war was and that it could be accomplished, so on and so forth. But a series of scandals, and I would say, again, the single most important being the discovery of the My Lai massacre, not when the massacre happened, but when it came to be discussed by American journalists and so on, it became common knowledge, led to Americans losing faith in the war project and in demanding an immediate end to the war. So that's also an aspect of democracy. And America is partly a democracy, and it's in very large part not a democracy. It's a hybrid, it's a mixed system, it's a mixed society. But one of the rare examples of democracy at work is that the American people demanded a sudden, immediate end to the Vietnam War, and eventually they got it. So that was an example of democracy in their House of Commons, shall we say, overcoming what other parts of society were demanding. Suleiman Ali asks a very telling question. He says, if you used to live in Scotland, what is the national beverage apart from beer? ? Hint, it's orange. So I know the answer to this, but I would assume Melissa, for example, does not. So Suleiman, here is your answer. I think they have an umlaut in this. Ernbrew. So yes, I really did live in Scotland. And I could not believe how absolutely horrible the taste of iron brew is. So that is a drink that is only sold in Scotland. And many people told me that if you didn't grow up drinking it, you would always hate the taste. An assumption I can only agree with. So Frida asks, maybe a nice question to close on is, so one's intelligence can only be measured by your choices. So no, I don't believe that at all, Frida. I wouldn't agree with that at all. So do you have a response to that, babe? So yeah, so I mean, yeah, I mean, you can see what she's getting at. I mean, I'm not that pessimistic. So go on. What would you say? Yeah, so I mean, so to relate it, I mean, so if I agreed with Frida here, we might say, like, for example, that what I was saying about Napoleon is, looking at his choices in life, looking at JFK and his choices, that you look at the choices they've made, and then you judge the person to be intelligent enough on the basis of those choices. I don't think that's true. Look even at Christianity in people's lives, that people believe in a religion for so many years and so on, and to some extent those choices are made for you. Or no, I wouldn't say that, but also the point is that intelligence can only be measured by your choices. That's what she's suggesting. I don't feel that way at all. I think we can measure intelligence. I think with all of the caveats that I've stated in this video and all of the warnings against the way in which data about intelligence is misused, no, you absolutely can. The warnings are considerable. However, let's say this too. I mean, most of these fields of endeavor are very fundamentally corrupt. If you really did develop, so Frida, I think we understood your point. So she was just reiterating, like making bad choices in life. So obviously, whether you choose to become a cocaine addict, whether you choose to cheat on your wife with a stripper, and again, we're assuming you don't sympathize with that. I think there are a lot of people who would say, well, strippers are people too. Maybe this guy had a really wonderful love affair with a stripper. Maybe this stripper understood him in ways his wife never did. Like maybe that was the most meaningful relationship of his life. Was this, why have these bad assumptions? He cheated on his wife with a stripper and he got a cocaine habit. But maybe that's the best thing he ever did in his life and not the worst, right? Like we have a lot of judgmental assumptions, built into this. No, so I mean, I'm joking around, but again, I'm really serious. Like, let's give a great example. Melissa just made a video. Maybe you guys have seen it. Maybe you haven't. But talking about her decision to not go to medical school. Now, someone could just judge that as wrong and bad and a sign of limited intelligence. They just say, "Oh, well, obviously, that was dumb or something." Like you're just a dumb person because you didn't become a medical doctor. Maybe, maybe that was the right decision for her. Like for a lot of people. Someone else who was mentioned in this video, Jacqueline Glenn. Jacqueline Glenn started on YouTube as a medical school student. She was in med school in training to become a doctor, and she dropped out. Now, some people would say that was the wrong decision, or that even proves that she's stupid, as if there's this inherent thing. Well, she also had a background in theater. She also wanted to be a comedian. She had other interests in life and other talents in life, and maybe she's too stupid to be a doctor. Like we're talking about Jacqueline Glenn here, no offense. But, knowing her as well as we all do now, maybe it would have been really awful for her to keep on struggling in medical school. Maybe she would have been a terribly inept and terrible doctor. Like maybe that would have been a really bad path for her in other ways too. So, I mean, we can go on and on about this. But looking at these choices people make in life as if there's a very simple, self-evident difference between good and bad, smart and stupid. Look, so let's turn. Why did I become a scholar of Buddhism? And why did I quit? Is it smart or stupid? So right now I have the option, guys. You can vote on this. Should I go back to school and get a PhD in Buddhist philosophy, PhD in Buddhist? I still got it. I still got the talent. Believe me, I've still got what it takes to get a PhD in Buddhism. Is that a good or a bad decision? Is that a smart or a dumb decision? If I go back and get a PhD in Buddhism, maybe that's the stupidest decision I could ever make in my life. And other people, especially there are people who write to me who've read my scholarship of Buddhism from that period of my life, and they say, "Look, this was really brilliant. You're really wasting your own, wasting your own potential in life." There are people who think it's stupid that I ever stopped being a scholar of Buddhism, and that the most intelligent, the most positive thing I could do would be go back to school and get a PhD related to Buddhism or Buddhist philosophy and spend my life scholar Buddhism. So no, anyway, Frida, I'm taking your question seriously both ways. It's not easy. And look, I mean, I've got to tell you, I don't believe all these things are subjective. I do think you can really look at Adolf Hitler and judge that he was stupid in his life. I do think you can look at Napoleon and judge that he was stupid. And I do think that some decisions are so morally wrong or so tactically wrong that it's not debatable. Not all these things are subjective and it's debatable, but I'm still really signing this series of warnings about the extent to which that subjective issue, where we're just presuming the amount that this person has in common with me, the amount they agree with my politics, it's to that extent that I'm judging them to be in the right and to be intelligent and smart and superior to other people, which is ultimately what we're talking about here. But look, sorry, the other huge factor here, though, is just money. Okay? I mean, so if you could evaluate objectively who is a good architect and who is not. Now, that's not too hard to imagine. You have a specialized test. It's not the IQ test. And you have to give them a bunch of problems and, okay, calculate the load-bearing wall. And, okay, here's a blueprint. Where are you going to put the electrical wiring? You could, let's say it's a 5-hour exam. Like that finance exam. I'm forgetting. Like the CFA exam for finance. You could have a really in-depth, thorough exam that really is calibrated to test the upper limits of architectural ability objectively, like in an objectively verifiable way. And nobody else is allowed in the room. You sit there and there are security cameras and nobody can help you and nobody can talk to you and there's no cheating. And this is really testing your mastery of architecture at a high level. Why doesn't that exist? Why doesn't every country in the world have it? Why isn't it on TV every year like the Olympics? Can you imagine a parallel universe, a different culture, where every year the competition for who is the most brilliant architect is a popular TV show? It could be. Why not? Who wants to watch football? This is ridiculous. Who wants to watch baseball? Let's watch people compete over their ideas of what is great architecture and prove their competence and mastery of this art form that affects all of our lives. Why not? So I'm just saying, despite all the warnings or coming together with all these warnings about what these tests do and don't prove and so on, no, I do think you could test, ability as an architect. And, again, with just the point that this is not your innate or inherent intelligence. It's what you've accomplished up till this moment, which will partly reflect your past intelligence, so on and so forth, right? But nobody wants to, right? Nobody wants to, because all that anyone is interested in is money, right? What if the most famous architect in the world, the most successful architect in the world, like Frank Gehry? So I'm getting into 6 degrees of separation here. Frank Gehry is a very famous architect. Okay, what if we can prove that Frank Gehry is an idiot? His buildings are worth millions of dollars. His contracts as an architect are worth millions and millions of dollars. Everyone wants to build up the mystique and the illusion that he's a genius. So Frank Gehry, again, I know people who know people, all right? He has this trick he does to make him look like a genius where he signs his name with 2 pens simultaneously. He has a red pen and a blue pen. He brings his hand and goes with both hands simultaneously. He signs his name in this amazing swirl of activity. What dexterity, what acumen, what brilliance. And of course, people who've never tried it think, wow, this guy's a genius. It's true that he's the greatest architect of the century or something. If you sat down and practiced doing that every day at 6 a.m. for a month, you could sign your name with 2 hands also. It's just completely, you know what I mean? Oh, we have to create this mystique. We have to publish books saying that he's a genius. I remember there was a book. This is a credit to Frank Gehry. And most of the book was photographs of his architecture with quotations from people saying he was a genius. But he actually included some quotations of people saying he was an idiot. I remember there's a quotation. It was just from another architect who said, the thing I appreciate about Frank is that he can create these insane spaces that are really unexpected. When you walk into the room, it's not what you're expecting the room to look like. But aside from that, I think his whole philosophy is bullshit. I mean, the guy's a crank, and it's just bullshit. And they included that in the books. It's great too. But no, there's an industry to make the university's degree in architecture seem like it's worth $1 million. There's an industry to make the building look like it's worth $1 million, or the contract with the architect. Absolutely nobody is interested in an IQ test if it proves that this great architect is an idiot. Absolutely nobody is interested in a test of architectural ability, architectural intelligence, architectural acumen, because we could test that. But nobody's interested in it if it proves that Frank Gehry is not a very good architect. Who knows what the impacts would be? What if it proves that the most expensive college is not producing the best architects? If there's a cheaper, smaller state college that actually produces people who do better on this test, now we got a problem. But this is the great school of architecture at this expensive college. You have to respect us. No, we don't. Now we have an objective measure of who's learning how to be a good architect and who's not. So yeah, with all these caveats having been stated, I do think there are meaningful tests of intelligence. They can be meaningful at the low end. They can be meaningful at the middle range, and they can be meaningful at the high end also. But we have to question seriously the motivations of the people who are designing these tests, the motivations of the people writing them, and we just have to have a sincere sense of trying to help others, of trying to make the world a better place, and engaging in this kind of research. Absolutely. You could do detailed intelligence tests in Cambodia to find out what the problems in the education system are and where they are and how they're distributed, and to identify the problems even ethnic minorities within Cambodia have. Because, by the way, there are multiple ethnic groups and multiple languages within Cambodia. It's not all one ethnic group. Absolutely. And some of that stuff might even kind of sound racist if you talked about it in an insensitive way. But you could get out and you could do intelligence testing that would turn up problems. You could do intelligence testing that would turn up where the clusters of drug addiction are. Look, it's turning up here. We have a lot of parents who are doing a lousy job raising their kids because in this particular area, there's chronic drug addiction. Like, if you were doing it in a sensitive, compassionate, helpful way, you could measure intelligence in a way that's really intended to help people and that's really intended to improve society. I have never once heard of a university doing intelligence tests to figure out which students need help. What if we do an intelligence test like for learning Chinese? Look, and guys, maybe this is where I don't really think I'm that gifted at learning Chinese. I don't. But all kinds of professors say, "Oh wow, that I'm amazingly gifted at learning languages." I don't believe it. I don't. Separate topic for I don't believe it. But other people perceive me as if I'm incredibly gifted at learning languages. Well, what if you test the intelligence of the students? We're all paying the same amount of money. Like, I'm so gifted. Well, I'm paying $5,000 to take this Chinese course. All these idiots are paying $5,000 also. Well, if you test their intelligence because you're actually trying to help them, you could test them and figure, oh, look, this guy over here, he can learn the new vocabulary in just 1 week. But we got these other students and they need a month to learn it. Well, then what can we do to help them? Never once in my life. I've never heard of intelligence testing. I've never heard of aptitude testing that's intended to help people. And it shows how sad and sick the whole province of pseudoscience is. So yeah, of course we could test aptitude. Of course we could test ability, and of course we could make the world a better place through well-intentioned, sincere social science research that's ultimately linked to political changes in policy. Thank you guys very much for joining me.